Welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk series, brought to you by AKFI, the Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first non-profit industry association committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, AI, and digital transformation. Actionable ESG Talk series bring together great minds to discuss the current state and the future states of ESG and sustainability and digital transformation. I'm delighted to be here with our guest, Matt Orsagh. He is the co-founder of Arketa Institute, and we'll find more details soon about the Arketa, where he contributes to aligning the financial system with environmental and well-being needs. AI, the heart of the Arketa's work is the question, what could make sustainable finance genuinely sustainable? That's a great question, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. Matt, again, welcome. And the first theme I wanted to touch on is the limits of traditional economics. In your white papers, in your work, you addressing that repeatedly, and how this address sustainability.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer your question, but let me just back up a little bit and talk about how I got to where I am and just a little bit about my background. Your
Please.
introduction, your introduction says this is where great minds come to talk. So I don't know if I belong here, but I want to give people a little background about what, where I'm coming from.
You
Um,
won't be invited if you're not part of the category, believe me.
well, thank you. That's nice of you to say. No, just to give people a little bit of context to where I'm coming from will kind of help, I think, in my explanations. I've been in the financial world for about 25 years or so. Before that, I was an English and film major in college because I really like storytelling. I'm a storyteller. A couple of years out of school, I realized I needed to be a little bit more marketable when we got my business degree. I like numbers as well. An interest in finance. I got a finance degree. That led me to getting a CFA charter. That led me to joining the actual CFA Institute itself, Chartered Financial Analysts Institute, for those unfamiliar. And since 2005, I worked with the CFA Institute until about 2 or 3 years ago. And I was part of the think tank arm of CFA Institute and doing research, writing, speaking on primarily ESG issues. My time there coincided with the rise of ESG. And so I've been in the sustainability world for a very long time, just that kind of helps set the context. About 6 or 7 years ago, I started coming across ecological economics and writing about degrowth and a post-growth economy. And you can tell by my career span, I'm a middle-aged guy. So I didn't really come across these things until I was in my mid to late 40s. And once I did, I realized there was a lot there in ecological economics and degrowth that I had never learned. I'd never been taught. And that really showed some of the flaws and limitations of the economic system we use today. And that's neoclassical economics. I'm not going to go into the history of economics, but neoclassical economics is kind of the flavor of economics we use today, that if you're at a business school or an econ program, that's what you learn. That's what you were taught. And the problem with neoclassical economics is it doesn't really take into account the energy very well. It does a little bit, but doesn't really very well take into account the energy that needs to go into any system and the waste that comes out of that system. It doesn't really, to get kind of a physicist, engineer's point of view, it doesn't really deal with the laws of thermodynamics, which I argue that any financial professional should really understand before they open their spreadsheets to begin with, because the laws of thermodynamics tell us what is and isn't possible in the physical world. Those laws are not negotiable. Those laws were around when the dinosaurs were here 65 million years ago. And our economics, of course, wasn't. And the limitations of neoclassical economics is people can probably picture the neoclassical economics graphic. We're in a podcast, so that's a little hard to think about. But on one side is firms, and you have an arrow from firms going to the other side, and that's households. And so the arrow going from firms to households is they provide jobs, they provide products and services. The arrow going the other way from households to firms is labor. We provide our labor to firms to produce widgets or services or whatever it may be. And that's a pretty good shorthand for how an economy works. But it doesn't really take into account what energy needs to go into those systems. I need energy to do that work. The firms need energy to run the plant, and what waste comes out of those systems. And where the laws of thermodynamics come in is the first law of thermodynamics is there's a finite amount of energy in the universe in our system. We're not
The conservation laws, right?
conservation laws. We're not making any more. We're not losing it. It's sunlight that comes from the sun is converted by plants or fossil fuels, but the energy is still there. And the second law of thermodynamics gets to entropy. If no system is efficient and breaks down and goes to chaos. My favorite example of my favorite analogy of this is like your teenage son's room. It starts off very neat, and over time it dissipates. The cleanliness dissipates. But a more elegant example I think is that a hot cup of coffee on the table. That energy dissipates through the room. It loses its energy, and you have to do more work using energy if you want to heat that up again. And so no system is 100% inefficient. You're going to have waste, mostly in the form of heat from those kinds of systems. And so if you really want to understand how our economy really works, you have to go into what is relatively new compared to neoclassical economics, but has been around for quite a while, ecological economics. And that does a better job of taking into account the energy needed in a system and the waste that comes out of the system. And that places real limits on what our economy can and can't do because we are just part of a much bigger system. And a great way to think about this is, and Herman Daly, is one of the fathers of ecological economics. I encourage people to go down the ecological economics and Herman Daly rabbit hole, beyond this conversation. But a great way he frames this is, I'm going to explain another graphic. I apologize, but it really sets the scene. Is for most of human history, we as human beings have lived in an empty world, as Daly puts it. And so think back to when we were hunters and gatherers, and we would settle by the stream for water and fish, and we would hunt game in that area, and we would pick nuts or berries or fruit from the trees. And our tribe that we were in would use up the stuff in that, and the water. We would use up the clean water, and after we were there, it would get dirty. After a while, we'd use up the game, would use up the vegetation. But we were nomads, and we would move to another place, and that place that we just despoiled, if you will, would regenerate. And so we might come back to that in 10 years and not realize, we were there before because we were in a relatively empty world, and our impact on the world couldn't harm the world that much because it would regenerate. Now we're in a full world where our activity is really pushing up against the boundaries of resource use, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's renewable sources of energy, what have you. We're really pushing up against those boundaries and past them in some ways. And I'll stop this. This is kind of a good framing of everything. I know I've been talking for a while, but a good way to understand how we know we're in a full world and past these planetary boundaries is the planetary boundaries framework that I encourage people to check out. And the planetary boundaries framework was instituted about 10, 15 years ago in Copenhagen by scientists and researchers there. And again, I encourage people to check this out if they're not familiar with it. And it breaks down, 9 natural systems that are really our life support system on Earth. Climate, is just one of them, climate change, but the climate itself is just one of them. There's also land use, which gets to deforestation and timber, and these are lands, water use, biodiversity. Novel entities is another one, which is really things that shouldn't be in the environment, but are. That's mainly plastics. Biochemical flows, nitrogen and phosphorus leaching into our waterways, and kind of poisoning those in some places. And then the one that we just crossed into the danger zone is ocean acidification. And that's we think back to your high school chemistry class, we all have a pH of our bodies. We're mostly liquid.
Good.
So the oceans, they have a natural pH. If they become too acidic, things can't live there. And we're getting to past a danger zone where if we continue on this path, all life in the ocean will have a very tough time surviving. That has, of course, huge implications for us. But those 9 systems, 7 of those we've breached, are in the danger zone, showing we're in a full world and we need to pull back from our resource use, pull back from our energy use, because in the end, that is our life support system that we're harming.
I, it's really a great way to frame the conversation today. Thank you. Uh, when we talk about sustainability, I found different, let's say, ideological and maybe philosophical threads.
Mhm.
One of them is we will survive. We did it always, right? We are nomadic, as you said. We move our tent or whatever, our cattle, and we move to the next pasture, and
Right.
again we started again. So there is this mentality that we are survivable, even if the planet, will change, and the planet, of course, doesn't care too much about humans or other forms of life. It's
Mhm.
uh, independent. Its existence, it's independent.
Right.
The other sustainability, it's, oh, the world is coming to an end, it's too late, and so on. That's in some way could be true, but it doesn't help the purpose of communication with people that need to take action.
Mhm.
The third one is like, okay, human innovation will continue, we'll find new forms of energy, moving from fossil fuels to fusion. I don't know, solar capturing will have already,
Right.
maybe get some meteorites with elements that can help us produce energy and so on. So, uh, could you go a little bit more deeper in ecological economics and sort of position it in this debate about are we on a precipice? Where are we falling already? Are we far away from the precipice? And there are some alarmists that are saying there is no precipice if you want. If you
Mhm.
if you want to address from a
Sure.
ecological economics in such a way that our audience will better understand the topic, the principles.
Sure. I'll start maybe by trying to scare people up
Good.
front and then back up from the ledge and kind of explain where I'm coming from. Um, if you spend any time in this debate in this world, reading this stuff, you'll hear about the concept of collapse. A civilization collapsing. Are we on the precipice of a civilization collapsing? Well, yes. The answer is yes, but the time scale is what matters. Every civilization before us in human history has collapsed, and there's been hundreds of them. You can go back and yet there are still nations where those places were. There's still people. So, these terrible events happened, often environmental in nature, sometimes political in nature, but societies collapse. Um, what brings that about? What's the speed of that happening? And what can we do about it? There was a landmark paper that came out of MIT back in, I think it was 1972, 73, called Limits to Growth.
Mhm.
And that was one of the first times scientists sat down and thought about and imagined the computing power they had back in 1972, 73 to do this research. But what they found was that we were using resources at a rate that about this time in our history, they were talking about the middle of the 21st century, which is nearly where we are now. We would hit some real tipping points from resource use, resource extraction, pollution. There'd be more famine. There'd be less resources to go around. All those things. Um, Inconsequently, I don't know if they knew this at the time, but if you go back and look, we were using the resources of Earth. Well, I'll back up 1 second. There's this great report that came out a couple of years ago. Um, the was it, oh no the no 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 I'm blanking on it, but it was it's called the short name is for the Dasgupta report. The gentleman who wrote it is in the UK. The economics of biodiversity. Finally
Mhm.
came up with the title. And there's other places I've seen numbers like this. But when I read that, there's a 300-page version of the report that you can read with a lot of footnotes. There's a 50-page version, and there's an executive summary that's 2 or 3 pages. You can read the executive summary. I read the whole thing, maybe not all the footnotes, but I read the whole thing way back when, a couple years ago. But one of the things that jumped out at me was the stat of we are using Earth as though, and its resources, materials and energy, as though we had 1.6 Earths to use. Now, of course, that's unsustainable. If
No,
you live
of
in
course.
if you live in the developed world, it's more like 3 or 4 or 5 Earths we're using uh, due to our lifestyle. Now, of course, that's unsustainable. But if you go back and look at the historical record, it wasn't until about 2070. I'm sorry, not 2070. That's in the future. It wasn't until about 1970, 1971, where we first, as humanity, tipped over where we were using more resources than were sustainable. Think back to the empty world, full world description I gave before. We lived into an empty world. I'm making air quotes until about 1970, 1971. Through all of human history, tens of thousands of years, we were in an empty world using our resources within our means as a planet until then. And it's only then that we tipped over into it. Now it gets into the limits of growth predictions. The limits of growth that I just described explained that we're going to be hitting these tipping points where it threatens the kind of collapse that we've seen with civilizations in the past. A
Is
researcher out of
this similar with the Club of Rome
it was the club
manifesto?
of yeah, that is the Club of Rome. They were out of MIT, the researchers, but they were part of the Club of Rome. A couple years ago, a researcher, thanks for that clarification. A couple years ago, a researcher at KPMG named Guy Harrington revisited those, you know, what they postulated, and she found similar, very similar trajectory. Now she had the computing power of, I think 2019, 2020 when she wrote it, sometime around there. And she
Or the
found
hyperscalers, what we call it,
yeah,
the
it,
latest architectures in
yeah.
data
What
centers.
she found that they were pretty much on track, that we're facing a very similar challenge. Now, so yes, we're collapsing, but we've been collapsing since for hundreds of years, just but on a very slow time scale, right? Was the collapse of our civilization going to happen 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 5,000 years, whatever it was? But we're very much accelerating that with what we're doing now. Uh, we're living way well beyond our means as far as resources. We're using 1.6, 1.7 worth of Earths, climate change and those other planetary boundaries I mentioned. We're pushing past what those parts of our life support system can adequately provide. And so we're going to start seeing, if we continue on the business as usual case, you know, more heat, more famine, more uh, extreme weather events, more flooding, tipping points such as, methane from the Arctic, thaw, the permafrost coming up, the AMOC current in the Pacific that keeps Europe about 5 to 10 degrees warmer than it normally would be. That could shut down, and you could have a mini ice age in Europe and parts of North America, and many others that we don't want to find. We don't want to find out. Those are just catastrophic events ecologically. And so, on any kind of human time scale, you know, our lives are 60, 70, 80 years these days. Those things can't be reversed on any kind of ecological timescale that matters to us. I was reading recently that after each mass extinction that we've experienced on Earth, it takes about 1 million years for biodiversity to recover. We're currently in the sixth mass extinction that is largely, man-made. And so if everything stopped tomorrow and started recovering, it would be about 1 million years until things recover to kind of the baseline we had before, our industrial revolution really turbocharged things. So that's kind of setting the scene. So yes, it's scary because
I'm
collapse is a
watching the
reality.
movie together with you because you're describing in visual terms. Thank you.
But so yes, we need to talk about collapse as reality, but because collapse always happens on Earth and always has, it always will. But we can manage this to some extent. Some things are already baked in. We can't reverse some of the things that are already the problems we have. But the paper we wrote at Arketa Institute back in April was really kind of a primer for people on these issues of what is ecological economics, what is degrowth, what is systems thinking, what does that mean for the financial world, and what does that mean going forward? Is to kind of give people an education about what's happening now, what the stakes are, and what we can do. So the title of the paper was "By Disaster or Design: A Post-Growth World is Coming." But we can manage it somewhat, or we could just wait for the disaster. And waiting for the disaster is just continuing on as business as usual, which will accelerate that collapse.
So I have so many threads. I'll pick up one
Yeah, sure, sure.
almost randomly in my mind. You brought the function of time, and the function of time it's in you have a political time, you have an economic time, you have a social time, you have a
Right.
planetary time.
Yeah.
They are not equal and not comprehensive, not compressible, rather at the same level, right? The political
Right.
times are in, few years in democratic countries.
Hmm.
In more authoritarian, it's still, 20, 30 years for as long as the dictator in power lasts, right?
Right.
So there is a time scale. During these time scales of the political time, people tend to make decisions in one way or another about sustainability. And I'm not going to get into politics of the jour because that will be another 2 hours discussion today. But
Hmm.
what are really the real capabilities of people to preempt and react to future events versus to react to past events, talking about time? Because we are great at reacting at past events. Was a train derailment, and now we're
Right.
fixing the rail.
Right.
Well, the rail was broken before the derailment,
Right.
if I may bring this image, right? So us as humans, a large percentage we are trained and we are made to be reactive and always believe that science or something or a power of above will help us survive. We have a survival instinct built in, and it's built in this time scale.
Hmm.
So now, how we take, right, we talked about people that inject a sense of urgency and fear. People usually react by fear at getting complacent, most of them. They say, okay, you scared me yesterday, you scare me now, tomorrow I
Right.
won't be scared. Think of your scary movies, right?
Yeah.
We get the formula. How
Yeah.
can we move forward? Because what you're saying is real, and my technical background tells me that we have a very limited control, not only time, to come up with a technological solution. And I think most of the modern societies believe that technology will save the day. It will be AI, it will be, I don't know, solar capturing, whatever. We talk about
Right.
fusion,
Right.
and we'll continue as usual.
Yeah. No, that's a great question because a lot of being in the sustainable investing world all these years, that was kind of what was sold is we'll have a technological solution to these things, whether it's fusion or one of my favorites is microwave radiation beamed from space. That is theoretically possible. Very cool.
There is a
But
startup. There is a startup trying to do that as we speak, actually.
Yeah, no, no, I know. I think there's probably more than one. And
But
mining of asteroids. You go to the asteroid belt, and all the gold and copper and cobalt and zinc and things you would ever need is there. But we still live on a place that has its limitations. Getting back to the physics and the chemistry of things is to start there. And there has been some progress in kind of decoupling our economies from energy use. So we have gotten greener, but it's by no means fast enough. Still about 80% of our energy in the world, it comes from fossil fuels. And, maybe 5 years ago, it was 85%. That 1% a year isn't going to be fast enough. But that also doesn't take into account the materials that we use. The materials we're using hasn't decreased and has increased. And so what we argue for is degrowth, moving to a post-growth society. And that is radical to a lot of people and challenging to a lot of people. And I understand that. It was to me when I first came across, it's like, oh, I don't like that. That doesn't make sense. But again, stepping back to where we've been as humanity for most of our time on Earth is the idea of growth being the reason we have our economies and the reason we do what we do is a very, very new concept. GDP as a measure only came about 90 years ago. And modern marketing that really pushed humanity to think of their wants as their needs to push consumption, to push growth,
uh,
only started about 100 years ago, from very small, beginnings. And so I kind of think of those as like modern marketing and the belief that growth is our purpose are very new things for humanity, and they don't have to be what we do going forward. Now, that's very ingrained in people's identities and people's jobs. The next paper we're working on is about the pension question of, we say to move to a world beyond growth, but what does that mean for people's pensions? What does that mean for people's saving for their children's education? Growth is so ingrained in our politics, in our culture, that we're not going to snap our fingers and
and
change
the
that.
economics, let's not forget the whole economics, all the economic schools I know of are
Right,
about growth, are about,
right,
cycles of labor, money, and
right, right.
goods,
Yeah,
products or
and
service.
yeah, we know this is a huge, huge change. We understand that. But again, getting back, the laws of thermodynamics are in charge. Our economics aren't in charge. We invented our economics to, to push a growth. Neoclassical economics evolved to push a growth agenda that we're now under. And that will change again, either by disaster or design. We're saying, let's design that. Let's have shorter work weeks. Let's design things more locally with more uh, clean energy wherever we can. But that alone isn't going to save us. Producing more things locally. There's a whole, I don't have time to go into all of them here. There's a whole raft of policy changes that you can talk about. But it really gets back to, and it's something I've been trying to learn more about, and I encourage people to do the same, is the whole bioregional movement. And I'll explain that very, very quickly. Is there's about 160, I think it's 165, 195 different bioregions around the country. You think I live in Central Virginia, I live at the foothills of the Smoky Mountains or the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the watershed I have is this river going into this river going into the ocean, and this forest. And my life and livelihood and the health of my community really depends, first and foremost, on the health of that bioregion, the mountains, the water, the forests, the biodiversity. And our modern lives, I was reading a study recently and wrote about, your average person in a developed country spends about 92% of their time indoors. And we've really lost that connection. And not only that, but we've very much lost our connection to our place in the natural world. That we think of the natural world as somewhere over there outside of
Mhm.
us. And again, this gets back to the physics and chemistry running things. Our economies are just smaller parts of a larger society, which is a smaller part of a larger biosphere, Earth. And getting back to the planetary boundaries, those things are in danger, and in the long run we're harming ourselves. And I understand that we have an economy and a political culture that is growth oriented, and I came up through that too. I'm 52 years old now, and for most of my life I was in that growth for growth's sake culture. I didn't even question it, but I realized that that's going to lead us to ruin sooner rather than later. Again, we can dial somewhat the when that collapse happens. Doing nothing is going to make it happen sooner. And just trying to design better systems that aren't as focused on growth is not, I don't, it's not a political action. It's self-preservation in the long run.